The Secret Service has sent reinforcements to Delaware to provide security fit for a president should Democratic Party candidate Joe Biden win the election. Meanwhile, the world is looking with anticipation at what a Democratic administration would mean for their engagement with the United States after the isolationism of the Trump years. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has continued to make unsubstantiated allegations of electoral fraud, retweeting claims about the integrity of the vote count. I'm now joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu and French journalist Daniel Brown from Chamarande, about 50 kilometers from Paris in France. Daniel, I'll begin with you, and thank you so much for your time. I mean, there's a lot, of people that are watching and waiting in anticipation to see what happens in the United States. Is that the same where you are?
Oh, absolutely. I think the Europeans are riveted on what's going on, be it the politicians or the civil societies that I've been in touch with. It's something that is being discussed all over. Here in France, they're rubbing their eyes in disbelief about Trump's premature declaration of victory, labeling vote counting as fraudulent. I mean, this is du jamais vu, as they say here, never seen before. It's been widely commented on as unprecedented, which I must say is strange, because it's as if all the excesses of the president since his inauguration speech back in January 20th, 2017, had not set the tone. So like 2016, when the Europeans widely believed that Hillary Clinton would sweep it, they thought there would be a blue wave with Biden. So there is a disappointment in terms of the knife-edge election results and the seeming balance in the Senate and even the House, where the Republicans have gained ground. People in England I talked to say his tweets, Trump's tweets and aggressive speeches from the White House is undermining their beliefs and confidence in American democracy. One person told me that she felt it had a deep impact on the Americans' beliefs and is creating chaos in this superpower. Some are even talking about their fear that Trump will not let go of power even if he loses.
And Sanusha, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. From what, Daniel is saying, I mean, obviously people are shocked by what has happened. But when you look at the fact that, a lot of people thought this was going to be a blue wave sweeping through the United States. But when you look at a state like Georgia, as my colleague Nicholas Bauer described it a short while ago, it's a blueberry in red soup. And certainly, are we surprised by this turn of events?
Good evening, and good evening to the colleague in France. I think, in a way, the anticipation that the Democrats will run away with this election, given the fact that you had 4 years of a very unprecedented, uncertain, and chaotic president in the White House. I think that was more or less what the polling and the pollsters and the surveys were predicting. And you look at the numbers, and the numbers kind of tell you a story. There's a story within a story here. And that narrative that you're seeing coming out is how closely contested this whole thing, this whole election is. I mean, if you look at the broad scale, the national scale of the election numbers that Biden is getting, as well as as President Trump is getting, Biden, I think, it's unprecedented in history. Much more, the numbers are much bigger, it's larger, but so too is what President Trump is getting. So it tells you, in a sense, that people have come out to vote in the U.S. I think that's the most important thing. I think if there's any message that the Democrats had went out there to make, is that people came out to vote, but at the same time, people also came out to vote for President Trump. I think the second thing is, as you talk about these battleground states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona. I mean, the numbers are so close. I mean, I think in Arizona, as I was looking at the numbers that just came in as of a couple of minutes ago, you can see that Mr. Biden's lead was around about 36,000, I think, yesterday or early yesterday morning. Today, it's around about just about 20,000. So you can see that that notion, that metaphor you drew about a blueberry in a sea of red is quite interesting, because it's the late votes, it's the mail-in votes, it's the urban votes, it's the suburban votes, and of course there's also the overseas votes that have to come in. But what's also intriguing about this election in the US, as much as we all I was talking to a colleague in California, and she said the 3 days felt like she aged 5 years. And I think that's very important in how much patience Mr. Biden is calling for, whereas President Trump is just completely losing the plot, and Twitter is labeling some of his tweets as incomprehensible, as in the context of speech and how you look at the implications. But I think the numbers that are coming out from these battleground states, if you look at where Trump was in 2016 in Arizona, it's about 48% to Hillary Clinton's around about 45, 46%. You look at where Biden is now. So these are really critical states for President Trump to catch up with Vice President Biden. But as the votes are coming in, those leads are getting, in some states they're getting a bit narrower. But is it enough for President Trump to claim that he won this election? And I think the fact of the matter is the illusion and the narrative that he's drawn in terms of already casting this election in an illegitimate light, and casting it as, people stealing this election, there's illegitimate votes. I think one of the counties that's going to come out right now is the one in, I think it's Pennsylvania, which is Allegheny. And that's a very critical one, because they stopped counting yesterday, because they have to basically go back and manually open the envelopes. It's also the question of those votes that came in, which can only be opened after the election the casting of votes stopped on Tuesday. And so there's a lot of manual verifications as well. And then don't forget the so-called litigation that's going to come out as well.
And Daniel, honestly, when you really look at what is going on and trying to make sense of it all, there is a period that we all need to look towards, and that is a period post what is going on in the US right now. And when you really look at, the impact of this particular process on the Euro-US, relations, should Biden or Trump win, what will it look like?
Well, that's a vast question, I must say. I'll try and break it down into the current situation and the shape it could look under each of the American presidential candidates. We can only say that at the moment. As things stand right now, like everything else during the Trump administration, it has been a tempestuous relationship between the old and new continents these 4 years. There's barely a week gone by without some skirmish, and it's pretty much one-way traffic. I'll let you guess which direction. So it's forced this bruised and battered Europe to revise things and that it took for granted, and it's pushed us to reflect on taking perhaps a more forceful senior role in world politics for issues like climate change, the migration questions, even new economic models beyond this rather failed neoliberal one that the US has exported for so many decades. So these relations have become brittle, and an example is this very recent conference by Emmanuel Macron, French president, who said that there was a need for the strengthening of an independent Europe to stand up to China, the United States, and the world disorder. And I basically was putting these two nations on an equal keel, as both, he says, threatens EU's interests. So Macron's looking for a third way, because politicians here feel they're tired of being the junior partner in this relationship. If Trump does win, it will be more of the same medicine Europe has known since 2017. In fact, it'll probably be a more aggressive, even less predictable administration. And he's unlikely to change his concerns over trade deficits, Europe's commitment to climate and to security. There's still these deeply embedded differences over Iranian sanctions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Russia and China. And these are bound to be exacerbated if Trump stays in office. As for Biden, there's obviously going to be a change of style. He's a transatlanticist, and Europe needs him to join a united front to negotiate the rapports with China, Iran, Israel, Russia, and so on. However, it's not going to be plain sailing. US-EU relations is a topic that was actually quite absent from the debate during the presidential campaign on both sides. And Biden will stay tough on issues like the tax of the GAFA, the rise in tariffs around cars and so on. I mean, he might have a deep attachment to his Irish roots, but the American economy remains his priority, and so does protecting American workers. If there's one thing I think the Democrats have retained over this last presidency, it's that they need to adopt more protectionism to woo the Trump voters, especially in the Midwest. And that's going to impact Biden's relationship with Europe. Clearly, this could be a wake-up call for the EU. I mean, after 4 years in the wilderness, there are more calls for it to be a senior partner, to take the Americans by the hand and bring it back to the fold. And so, you know, they do need to call the shots on what this post-COVID-19 world is going to look like.
And Sanusha, when you know, Twitter has really been kept busy by Donald Trump, certainly, because he just tweeted 46 minutes ago that I won this election by a lot. And, you know, Twitter has had to now put a disclaimer to say official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted. And certainly they've been working overtime to either try and, you know, either report those tweets, take them down, make sure that people are not seeing them. But while they're trying to do this, it certainly doesn't look like the message is filtering through to those that support him, that they should be patient and wait for the outcome of this election, because we've seen a lot of protests.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right. I mean, you know, President Trump has been really good in how he weaves a narrative on Twitter, and it's actually put Twitter on notice in terms of how they need to filter these tweets and look at the way these tweets are being used and what kind of subtext that they are sending through to Trump supporters. I think it's a very deliberate strategy. You know, listening to one or two news agencies yesterday on Wednesday, people were saying that even within his advisory camp, they were warning him not to say these things because of what the implications and how this will play out on the ground. But it's a deliberate strategy, and I think that in itself is perhaps what President Trump is trying to do, is that it's destabilizing the entire system, and he's putting it out there because he knows, you know, it's such a close call that he's going to probably not make it over the line with the current 213 electoral college votes he has, and what Vice President Biden or former Vice President Biden has as 253. Vice President Biden just needs one of those battleground, one or two of those battleground states, and it will just tip him over. I mean, some are predicting around about 306 electoral college votes. So what Trump is doing is that he's putting his voters, he's putting his support base, his electoral base out there, and where you are basically now delegitimizing this election and delegitimizing all those people who went out to vote, and also those that cast their vote, mainly Democrats, through the mail-in ballot. And more importantly, I think what it is that his indication he's not going anywhere now. I mean, I think if the numbers weren't that closely contested, I don't know. I'm being wishful whether he would have conceded by now. But I think he's treating this as if he's on the Apprentice show. And he's basically saying, I'm not going anywhere. He's having fights with his legal team. They're going out and they're trying to get donors to start supporting their litigation campaign, calls that they're going to start initiating legal battles and contests in these different battleground states. Around about one figure that came out was around about $60 million that they need to start litigating just to get there. But you know, at the end of the day, what is so interesting about this election is that if it was in any other country, we would have had people saying, oh, it's not free and fair. Look at this president. He's making all these statements. We need to start we need to start imposing sanctions because the democratic process is under threat. Unfortunately, in the U.S., it seems to be quite messy at this point. And so nobody is calling this election in terms of what President Trump is doing, in terms of what is a democratic, normative, open process. And I think that's where the rationality, the calmness, and what Vice President Biden did earlier last evening, well, it was basically a day during the day here, where he called for patience. And that's something that CNN and all these news agencies are so wary to call it, because they did this the last time and they got it wrong.
And I tell you, Sanusha, they've just called it, and I want us to talk about this after the break. They've just called it. CNN Sky have just called it to say that he is now the 46th president of the United States, and that's Joe Biden. That they just, some media houses are starting to call this as well. But I want us to talk about what this all means going forward in just a moment, because certainly it's not going to be an easy road ahead for Joe Biden. He inherits a divided America, because if anything, this tally has told us and has shown us is that Americans are not singing in one voice. And we continue with this particular conversation on the other side of this. We continue our conversation with Sanusha Naidu and Daniel Brown, who's a French journalist, and Sanusha, of course, is a political analyst here at home. Sanusha and Daniel, just before we went for the ad break, we saw quite a number of media houses are starting to call it, and they're saying that Joe Biden is to become the 46th president of the United States. And this is in contrast with what Donald Trump has just said in a tweet just under 50 minutes ago, to say that he has won this election by a lot. Certainly, Daniel, when you look at what this turn of events is going to be, things are not going to be easy, going forward.
No, I mean, I think what clearly this has shown is that the United States is a divided nation, and it's not just about Trump, but also about Trumpism and all the values that he espouses and that he promotes and that he's been actively pushing. This is also a reality where Biden will have to negotiate with the Senate, that for the moment is 50-50, and it depends on what happens in Georgia in January. And Georgia is normally a conservative state. So if the Senate does go to the Republicans, then Mitch McConnell will be a dominant force. There's, of course, the question of the Supreme Court, and that's going way beyond Trump's tenure, where the conservatives and ultra-conservatives dominate 6-3. There are several ways where Biden will have an uphill struggle, and he has to be aware of this deep split. And we're talking about a split where really it's quite interesting when you look at a map, where the center seems to be hostile and conservative compared to the coastal regions and the regions around the lakes. There's also a divide, I feel, in many ways between the genders, where it's a male-dominated political culture that has become more conservative, and the women and the minorities have been instrumental in swinging the votes towards the Democrats, and that's there's been surveys which have shown in battleground states that it's been essentially the result of the vote of the African Americans, the Hispanic minority, and the women that have swung it. So all this will have to be negotiated with a lot of skill by Biden, and it's no foregone conclusion. I think the real reality that we've seen in terms of these elections is that the United States is by no means an ideal democracy. I mean, even here with the record number of voters, we are still at only 206 million votes out of 240. That's around 70%, which, in most Western nations is quite a poor turnout for a presidential election.
And Sanusha, as I speak, to you right now, there's live visuals, of the Trump campaign, and we do understand that his lawyers are standing by to address, either the media and those people that are gathered there. But certainly, Joe Biden has been calling for calm, has been calling for patience, has been saying, keep the faith, that we've got this. But when you look at what has been on the other side of, the Trump campaign, there's really been, kind of like, messages of, we've got this, we won this, so don't allow, this campaign to be cheated. Are the calls by Joe Biden likely to fall on deaf ears, particularly calling for calm because he's inheriting a deeply divided country?
Yeah, I think firstly we've got to be careful in who's calling this election right now. You've got to remember that these results have to be verified, authenticated. They have to go through the official monitoring, evaluation, and the official process, and all of that. And then coupled with that, you've got I think in Georgia, the Secretary of State that's going to be made an announcement, said it's too close to call. There'll be a recount. Now, what the Trump administration has done is that they've put into play their lawyers, their litigation, and so has the Biden camp. I mean, let's not be unaware of the fact that in the context that this time around the Democrats are also prepared for what's going to become litigation and how they're going to go forward. So the first thing I would say is, those news agencies that are calling it, I think we'll just have to be a little bit more patient outside of the US. I think they've been patient enough. But I think the point you make about assuming theoretically that Biden has won, that he's taken maybe one of the big swing states, which is Pennsylvania. Then, of course, he takes the other little smaller states with 11 I think 6 in Nevada, 11 in Georgia. But again, Georgia, there's definitely going to be a recount there, according to what some of the American media houses are saying. So I think what we've got to be careful of is what this means going forward. So this result that we're looking at right now could take another 10, 15 days. I don't know how long, depending on litigation, depending on what the Trump presidency does, depending on all of these things in terms of those, what Trump calls the illegal votes, because he believes he won the legal vote, however he defines it. And so I think that's the one issue. And then assuming all goes according to the litigation goes forward, and then of course Biden is then the 46th president of the United States, and then of course he has to now have to go and be sworn in January. Up until that point, we don't know what Trump's going to do. We don't know what the supporters are going to do. So what he's inheriting is a very divided America. He's inheriting America that is also looking towards how he's going to not just heal a country, but bring about some serious issues around employment, around the fact that 43 million people have filed for unemployment, very much with what Daniel was talking about, protecting of the jobs, not just the blue collar workers and in those states that were essentially considered to be Republican states, but he also has to work with what a Senate will be like. Now, at the moment, that race is also something we should be keeping an eye on, because the Senate is a critical space, and Mitch McConnell and all of those individuals. So if Biden wins, there's also the possibility that Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will also have, I think, 2 votes in the Senate. I have to stand and read and look at that more clearly. But my understanding, she'll have two votes, so that will bring it up to 3. And then, of course, what's the runoff like in Georgia in January? How the Republican Senator Mitch McConnell will basically go ahead and try and maybe get that going on. But I think there's another issue here that has to be also looked at. If you look at where Trump is behind Biden in some of those swing states, and you look at where the Senate race is and where some of the incumbents are retaining their position as Senate positions, it's quite interesting that maybe what we are seeing is some of the votes actually went towards keeping a Republican Senate, keeping it a kind of 50-50, accountable, keeping the Biden presidency in check, and how they will have to work with a Republican kind of Senate, and of course you have a Democratic presidency. That's going to be interesting, because I think this is where you can't afford this kind of aggressive, this kind of a non-applicable approach that you see that the Trump presidency had basically convened, and it was all about just pushing back and being very, very combative in the context of this country. So going forward, I think there's going to be a lot that Biden needs to do to stabilize the American electorate, stabilize the democracy broadly, build some kind of social cohesion, deal with an economy, but more importantly, deal with a healthcare system that is frail and a healthcare crisis in the terms of COVID-19.
I tell you, it's definitely, going to be quite a challenging road ahead. And I want us to come back when we pick up our discussion with you on, the fact that is, from what you've said, can we expect a concession speech? But I just want to quickly go to Daniel. I mean, Daniel, when you look at, how France has historically, related to previous presidents of the United States, apart from Trump, what has been that relationship? What has that relationship been like?
I'll be glad to come back to that, but if I could just bring up a couple of points about what has just been said. I think that you asked about the call, will it be calm or not? I do think there will be a wave of optimism that will come out of the results, and that it could actually dampen the aggressive nature that we've seen in the past from the Trump supporters. I think when we question the AP, we should be careful. They have a tradition in terms of the results. They have a tradition going back to 1848 of being very, very accurate in terms of results. So where I absolutely agree with you, your earlier point is that there is definitely going to be judicial battles, and that we have to remember that Trump has been steadfastly stacking these courts around the country so that they could, swing towards him. It's going to be interesting in many ways to see how that's going to pan out, the judicial battles that are going to take place. Coming to your question, though, about how France is related to previous presidents. I mean, it does all depend on which presidents we're talking about. Jacques Chirac's relationship with George W. Bush, it's very different to the one that Nicolas Sarkozy had with Barack Obama. What does seem consistent across the board is that there's a French obsession with showing its powerful partner that France is a friend, an ally, but not aligned. Those aren't my words, by the way. The former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine, coined it. And it really does actually prickle American presidents. They see France as a small, economically limited ally with a rather superior attitude that's claiming sovereign equality. So there have been moments of tension, especially over major international affairs. We all remember the Jacques Chirac and Dominique de Villepin opposing the Iraq invasion by the United States. But even before then, General Charles de Gaulle warned the United States that Asia would not submit to its will back in 1966 at the height of the Vietnam War. On the other side of the Atlantic, there's French bashing is really a common practice. And here in France, the left continues to denounce American interventionism at all levels, political, military, and culturally worldwide. So I think there's going to be interesting developments between an Anglophile like Emmanuel Macron, who speaks very good English as a result of his stay in Nigeria, and Biden, who, as I said earlier, has a real affection towards his Irish roots and origins, and he is someone who is a veteran of international affairs, and I think his close advisors are going to be people who are really very close to the pulse of Europe. Former American ambassador in France is likely to be nominated as one of his closest advisors. So I think it's going to be an interesting development and evolution, and unquestionably the style, of course, is going to be very different to the previous administrations.
It's certainly going to be an interesting road ahead, and we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time to both of you. That's Sanusha Naidu and French journalist Daniel Brown from Chamarande, and that's about 50 kilometers from Paris in France.